Hey, how's it going guys? My name is Dom and today I'm going to be showing you how to build this counter using JavaScript Web Components. Now, we can see here I can do things such as increase or decrease that number, and that value or that state is going to be contained only within this instance of that component. And you can of course create many of these counters across your entire web page. They're all going to have their own state. They're all going to be contained within themselves. So this here is going to really be a introduction tutorial into web components. So it's going to be great to learn if you haven't used them much before. You can of course expand on this and do your own thing as well. Now, all of the source code is going to be linked down below if you want to follow along while you watch today's video. But either way, let's hop into this tab right here and begin from scratch to create what I just showed you. Now, going inside the VS Code right here, we're going to be firstly starting with this index.html and importing the JavaScript files which we need. So let's go to the left side here, make a new folder called JS. We're going to be creating a new file called index.js. This here is going to be the main JavaScript file which executes for the page. We can now import this within the head of the HTML with a script type of module. This is because we're going to be using the import-export syntax to create this counter component. So make sure you have a type of module right there. And for the source, we're going to say js/index.js. So now we have the JavaScript file loaded. We can now begin by creating a new JavaScript class. Now, we're going to be representing our web components using this class. So let's make a new folder called components, just like this. Then within here, make a new file called counter.js. So like I said, this here is going to represent the component itself. All of the code is going to be within this file right here. Now, when you are defining a new web component, essentially your class needs to extend from the standard HTML element interface. In other words, it needs to be a HTML element, right? So we're going to say class counter, okay, extends HTML element just like this. We're going to now leave the class body blank, all right? But we need to also export default class counter. This way, we can now import this custom web component within this index.js file. So we can say here, import counter from, then I can say ./components/counter.js. If you have trouble getting this code to run in your browser, make sure you have .js at the end of the file. That right there may fix your problem, okay? Cool. So now we have the counter loaded. How do we now register this component on the HTML page? Essentially, how do we say that, you know, if I was to say, for example, write counter like this, okay, how do we then bind this HTML tag with this counter class, okay? That is what we're going to be doing right now. So this step involves essentially latching onto the custom elements global object in the window. So we're going to say here, custom elements dot define, and then within here, provide the name for our custom element tag. Now, one rule here to follow is that there must be a dash within your custom web component name. So we're going to say here essentially just counter-component, okay? Now, as a second argument, we're just going to say counter as the class just like this. So of course, name this whatever you like, but essentially this here is defining what the tag should be and how we can link up this tag with this class file. We can now rename this to be counter-component with the dash. Remember, must have a dash inside there. So now this here is all valid and working code. We have our custom HTML element for the web component. We can now go back inside the browser here, and checking out the elements section in the dev tools, we can see that yes, indeed, our element is now on the page. But of course, that is only one part of the puzzle. We also need to write the code for the element itself. So the way this is going to be structured is we are going to be having a render function, which is going to run every time the state changes, or it's going to be up to us when this render function runs. But for this video, we're going to be running it every time the state changes. So in other words, when the user increments the number, we're going to rerun and redisplay the new data. Okay, so let's hop down inside this class and begin by defining a constructor just like this. Now, if you define a custom constructor, it's important that you run the super constructor as well. So in other words, this here runs the code within the HTML element class, and this here is going to be crucial to getting this to work, right? Now, like I said, we spoke about the render, step. So we're going to have a function called render right here, or a method called render. We're going to be filling this out very shortly, but this here, like I said, is going to be updating the DOM within the custom element or the web component to have the most recent data. Okay, so let's stop right here and go back inside the constructor and begin by writing out some code. So firstly, in order to define custom elements within our web component, or that was bad terminology. What I meant to say was to define our own DOM or our own HTML within the web component, we need to use what's called a shadow DOM, and this ensures that this markup or this HTML is contained only within the web component itself, so other things can't affect it. So that's called a shadow DOM. So we're going to say here this.attach shadow and then provide a mode of open. So it's one argument to this function here, or this method, and you say mode open, which means we are going to be allowed to update and insert elements into our shadow DOM. Okay. So once we've done this, we can then say this.render. So when the component first loads up, okay, the constructor is called, we're going to run the initial render. Okay. What does that initial render look like? Well, we're going to simply say this.shadowRoot, okay, dot inner HTML is equal to, and then within here, we're just going to say paragraph and say hello. Is this working? Okay, so we're going to stop right here. I'm going to show you guys some results now. So if we go inside the browser, we can see we get hello, is this working? Now, let me just investigate this a little bit more. We can see here in the DevTools under elements, in the counter component, we have a shadow root. If I expand this, we have the paragraph tag right there. So like I said, this here is your own little contained element, which you can put other elements inside of. Of course, in the case of the counter, we have things such as the label, the increment button, and the decrement button, right? So those are three elements that we're going to be including within this shadow DOM, okay? And of course, in this case, we used inner HTML to, of course, inject that value, right? So we're going to update this now to instead be a little bit more modular. We're going to use template strings right here. We're going to hop down to a new line, and we're going to use an expression within the template string to say this.template.trim. So what is this.template? Well, this method template we need to now define. Okay, so let's go up in the top of the class here, and we're going to say template is equal to an arrow function, just like this, right? And we're going to say within this template string, we're going to put the HTML. So let's put that paragraph tag back. Okay, we're going to say hello. Is this working? Okay, just like this. So now essentially all done is we've simply taken the HTML and moved it inside a function called template, or a method called template. And we're simply calling that method within here and then saying .trim to get rid of any extra white space around the actual string. So now if I save this, go back in the browser, we get the same result. So you can see it's still working just fine. Okay, so the point of this template function or method is so we can have our own little space to just define what the HTML looks like. okay? Because later on, the render is going to be updated to also include some CSS. So we'll see that very shortly, but for now, let's actually go ahead and write out the HTML, which is required for the counter. Like I said earlier, we have the label, we have the increment and the decrement buttons. So going back inside VS Code here, we can simply update this to be a div with a class of value, and then provide within here, let's just say 0 just for now. Then we're going to say div with a class of buttons. And then hopping down here, we can also say button type of button with a class of, once again, button. And we're going to say button dash increment. So basically we are just flagging this button as being the increment button. We can now end that off right there and just put a negative sign within that text. We can make a second button called button dash decrement. This one here, of course, is going to decrement the value. I might just put a plus inside the increment. That will make a lot more sense. So we have the HTML for our shadow DOM, and all of this is going to be contained and only available within the counter component. This is the beauty of having a shadow DOM. So now if I was to save this, go back in the browser, we get this right here. Okay, fantastic. You can also see that I didn't actually prefix these class names with things such as counter dash value and counter dash buttons, because like I said, everything is contained within this component. When it comes to CSS, we can target these classes directly, and since we're in the context of this file, there is no need to prefix it with counter dash. Of course you can, but there is no real need to within the context of this class. Okay, let's now move on to writing out some of the CSS for the template. So up here, we're going to define a new variable called CSS equal to, then use once again the template string, so the backticks near the 1 on your keyboard, okay? Hop down here, and we're going to be writing out some CSS. Now I might just copy and paste what I've got in my example. Once again, you can see the source code down below if you want to copy all of this CSS here. It's just not worth going over because it is not the main, purpose of this video, right? This video is about web components, not about CSS. So we're going to avoid that for now. You can simply copy and paste it or add your own CSS for the buttons. But we can see here, one important thing to mention would be this :host. Okay, so all of this stuff down here is standard CSS. We're simply targeting the class, and of course these classes refer to what's inside the template, right? But this :host actually refers to the element itself, counter dash component. Okay, so going back inside the browser here, this counter component right here, that is what the CSS under :host is going to apply to. So if I was to save this here and then go down into the render component, we now need to essentially inject those styles into the template, because at the moment, if we go into the browser, the shadow root doesn't contain any CSS, it only contains our divs. So we need to inject those styles. We can hop down here and say style, just like this, as per normal HTML, right? Then use template strings expression. We can say this.css, just like that. I can save this, go back, I'm going to say .trim as well. There we go. Save this back in the browser, and now we have the CSS injected. If I expand this, we have the CSS right there. And all of this, like I said, is contained for our counter component. Fantastic. So we have the main DOM for the component. We now need to, of course, worry about some state. So how do we go about doing this? Well, we can define state inside the constructor. We can say this.value is equal to 0. Now, the beauty of the separate function for the template and the whole rendering situation is we can then inject that state within the template. We can say right here, $, then curly brackets, this.value, okay? Just like this. I'll save this, go back in the browser, and we have the same results. If I make this a 20, for example, save back in the browser, it goes to 20. So we can see here we're able to have our state in the constructor or in the component itself, the instance. Then within the template function, we can of course access that state and conditionally render things. You can apply transformations. You can create your own computed properties. Of course, you can do this by simply making this an actual function with curly braces, just like this, and then returning that value instead of having it, a direct return. So, just simply paste that within there. Now we have the return with the template string. We can now create constants, computed values, etc. That is the beauty of having this template function, right? Cool. So down here, we've got the value set. How do we now handle the events for when the user clicks on the button to increase or decrease that value? Well, let's hop right down here and have a new event handler for onIncrementButtonClick equal to, and then inside here have a new function. Let's do the same thing for the decrement, so onDecrementButtonClick. Okay, so we have these two separate handlers for each one of the buttons. The increment is going to say this.value plus plus, okay? The decrement is going to say this.value minus minus. However, we need to cap this at 0. So if the user tries to go under 0, we need to prevent it from happening. So we can see here in my example, I'm doing minus, nothing, and it doesn't work. Actually, if I go back to my actual example, my apologies. If I minus, once we get to 0, it no longer works. So how do we prevent that? Well, very straightforward. In the handler, we can just say this.value equal to math.max0 and this.value minus 1. So basically, take the value, subtract 1. If that number is the highest out of 0 and that number, then we're going to use that number, otherwise use 0. In simpler terms, the minimum number that can be returned from math.max is going to be 0. So we can't have negatives, right? Okay, we have the code for increment and decrement. After this operation happens, we need to now re-render the component. We can say this.render just like this. Save this, go back in the browser, try to click on them, and of course they don't yet work because we haven't bound these event handlers to the actual buttons themselves. How do we do that? Well, within the render, this is where, once you've injected your HTML, this is where you can now start to have those event handlers. So we can say this.shadowroot.querySelector. Remember, shadowroot is very similar to a standard document object, which means you can call things such as querySelector just fine. We can say querySelector button -- increment, okay? The increment button dot add event listener. Let's add the click listener to the increment button. Okay, what happens when you click on the button? We can just say this.onIncrementButton click just like this. Save this back in the browser, click on the increment, bang, and the number goes up. We can see here, of course, it is getting re-rendered in the shadow DOM just as like we expected. Let's do the exact same thing for the decrement button. So we can say here this.shadowroot.querySelector, and we're going to say button-decrement just like this, then say this on decrement button click. Save this back in the browser and we are now done. I can increase the value, decrease it, and it all works just like we expected. I can try and go below 0. That also doesn't work. Now, one last thing to mention with these components is that any state you have on the actual instances, you can reference in your standard JavaScript code. So if I go back in the index HTML, I now want to give an ID to my counter component. I can say something such as my counter. Then within the index.js, we can say const my counter equal to document.getElement by ID. Provide here your my counter. And we can now say console.log myCounter.value. Okay, so that right there is going to work. Now, maybe value isn't the absolute best name for a property since it is similar to the input elements value property. But just to demonstrate, if I was to save this, go back in the browser, in the console, when the page first loads up, of course, we have the value of 0. Fantastic. If I was to then say I can't actually because I'm in a module, but if I was to quickly just do a set timeout here, I'm just going to say after 2 seconds, log out my counter.value. So after 2 seconds, save this, increase the value, and we get 3 right there. So we can see that's working perfectly fine. And I guess it's also worth quickly covering the actual counter component element itself, so the host element. We can see here we have those styles applied to it, but also I can override those styles myself. For example, I can say a width of, let's just do 100 pixels, it's going to decrease. So the styles on the host component can be edited by yourself. You can add your own things to it, customize it. But of course, everything within the DOM itself, the shadow DOM, that is where it's all sheltered off and secured to only your component. So that is how to build a counter component using JavaScript Web Components. If this video helped you out, make sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.